From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
So welcome everyone to this episode of Psych Health and Safety in Canada. And today I'm really thrilled to announce that I have Angeline Ram with me. And sometimes life is just so serendipitous. I did a conference, an aviation conference, and I was scrambling to get my stuff out because the next speaker was coming in, and the next speaker turned out to be Angeline. And we started talking, and it was just this immediate understanding that we had some shared purpose and shared vision for where psych and health and safety can go. So I'm happy to welcome Angeline, and I'm going to get her to tell you she's had a long and winding road to where she is today, and I'll get her to share that with you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mary Ann. And you know what the interesting thing, it's almost a year ago that we met at that conference, because I'm going to be speaking at that very shortly. And so what had happened was Mary Ann was speaking, and I was sitting there engrossed, and I'm also working on my PhD. And as she was speaking about psychological health and safety, I thought, this sounds so familiar, but I didn't know how to label it. Like, I didn't know the language. And so as a safety manager, I was sitting there and I was thinking, this is so important to everything that we do. And I walked up to Mary Ann and I said, I really, really want to follow you. And she goes, okay. And so she gave me her information. But before that day that I met Mary Ann, I think we can go back to 20 years ago when I started my experiences in the world of aviation. And I started off as frontline staff, as a flight attendant. And through that process, I've always been a learner. I always wanted to do more. And so I literally went overseas. I worked overseas. I came back to Canada and I wanted to do more. And I fell into this world of aviation safety and I loved it. It was absolutely exciting, extremely rigid, because everything was predefined for us. And I always felt like investigations were a little bit of safety gossip, because you got to hear things that were happening and nobody else knew and I knew. And I guess that makes me sound a little bit nerdy, but hey, I knew what was happening. Through that journey, what was very interesting was as I started to further advance and learn more things about how to develop this craft of safety, right? Specifically safety management within the world of aviation. What started to happen was I started to feel unsafe. And I know that sounds a little bit funny, Mary Ann, but I would sit there and nobody would believe it, because I would smile and I'd be like, hi, everybody, safety's great. Let's report, right? And I was raw, the safety person. But I started to enter this very dark world where I didn't want to acknowledge that I was being bullied. I found it really bizarre that I was working these 16-hour days, putting awards on the walls and, supporting the organization regardless of what they needed. And it was starting to just eat away at my soul, right? And I didn't want to tell anybody because I was so embarrassed that I didn't have what it took to make it, right? And that's really what it came down to. So I didn't want to talk about it because I was so embarrassed that I couldn't make it in this world that I had been in, right? What started to happen was I knew there was something wrong when I went to my boss and I said, listen, if you don't mind, I'd like to, take Mondays, a couple hours so I can go see a counselor so I can understand how to deal with somebody yelling at me. Right. Which is kind of weird. Right.
Was it that counselor that was yelling at you that you
No.
asked?
No, it was one of the higher ups in the organization, where whenever they would speak, if they didn't like what I had to say, they would just, give it to me. Right. And it was quite normal. It was the culture that I was in. And so I started to see that as me being the problem. And as I spent a little bit more time, what I've started to notice was, I think when people started to observe that I was facing challenges, found it particularly odd. I'd be washing my hands in the bathroom and somebody would come up and they'd be like, you know, I don't think that was fair, right? But these were all things that were happening behind closed doors, and nobody was willing to speak up and say, oh, this is a problem. And you know what? Eventually, I got to the point where I was seeing this fantastic person who was dealing with psychotherapy, and they said, I don't think the environment that you're in is good for you. And I thought, really? Right? Because it was the first time, it was the first time I'd actually heard that perhaps maybe I wasn't the problem, and perhaps the environment that I was in was creating this I would say psychologically unsafe environment, and I didn't know what it was. So fast forward, I finally said, you know what, I was working full time, I was doing my PhD part time, specifically researching the experiences of people, right? And what affects safety reporting in the workplace. And it was about that time that I thought, you know what, I'm okay if I walk away from this for a period of time, right? I would rather sit there and become a full-time student, right? Rather than sit there and hope that I die on the 401, because it had gotten that bad, right?
Wow.
It had gotten that bad where every day as I was driving down the 401, I was like, you know what? Wouldn't it just be easier if I didn't have to go to work today? Right? And then if something happened to me, I wouldn't, my parents they wouldn't accept if I did something to myself, right? God forbid. So I had all of these very dark thoughts, and it's taken me 2 years to actually start talking about it. And so that's kind of what brought me forward and has allowed me to say, let's give workers the opportunity to voice their lived experiences, and talk about the challenges that are affecting them in the workplace. That's degrading their overall well-being, but that's inextricably linked to also how they engage in safety behavior in the workplace.
So I have to comment on a couple of things, Angeline. One is that what you have done is the definition of post-traumatic growth, that you went through this very difficult, life-threatening situation, and you turned it around to help other people. And now in the field of psychological health and safety, and we're going to talk more about what you're doing today. I'm really sorry that you had to go through that. And I'm really grateful that you're using it to help others to avoid that kind of situation. I also want to comment on working 16-hour days and how that in and of itself breaks down our ability to stand up against bullies, breaks down our ability to put it into perspective and to know it's not me. It is this person's unhappiness in the world that makes them do that. And it's, I know I'm working from a place of integrity and doing what I want. So the two pieces that I want to say to people who feel they're in that is pull back. This whole concept of quiet quitting, when I was asked about it, I said, if you are burning out, that going back to doing your job and just your job and not being ambitious and feeling like you're never good enough and feeling like you have to strive for 16 hours a day, if that's quiet quitting, that is called work-life balance. And for people who are burning out, or worse, it's called survival.
Mhm.
So we really need to help with people recognizing that, first of all, those dark places are temporary and that there's ways to pull yourself out of it.
Mhm.
If you could go back and speak to that person who you were at that time, what would your advice be now?
I often think about, I wish I just knew that I had rights. And I know it sounds so simple, but I wish I could sit down and say, you know what, you're doing the best you possibly could do, right? And I know that people used to say, hey, Angeline, slow down a little bit, you don't have to do that. And And I had created this false narrative of what success looked like. And I think it's rooted back to this idea of, we've got these businessmen that work 24/7, that are constantly on their phone and very busy. And to a certain degree, that's kind of where I was headed. I was like, that's what I want to look like when I grow up. Um,
Like a stressed out man. Good for
right.
you.
Like, I know that it's, I'm never going to look like that. Like stressed out, yes, but not a stressed out man. And I think in the absence of having role models or people that we could look at that said, this is what a successful life looks like in the sector of aviation, I was constantly striving for something that I could never have. And so what I would tell myself was, you know what, you were doing a great job and you did everything you needed to do, except take care of yourself. And that was the number one thing that I didn't do, was I didn't make myself a priority in the process. So what I've come to realize, especially through the work and the research that I'm doing, is that individuals need to take care of who they are as a person. And it comes down to that idea of their general well-being, right? In order
But
to be successful.
I bet you heard that though
I did,
and ignored it.
I
And
did.
so what do you think would have changed your mind?
To be honest, I don't know. It literally took me leaving the sector and integrating into a different sort of environment. That's what it took me. It took me becoming a student and changing my life, right?
Mhm.
Um, Especially because I was in that environment. So the truth is, I don't know what would have triggered it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that, often you say it's the pandemic has taught us many things, right? And this was all pre-pandemic, right? And I think that since that time, it's been about 2 years, if we think about it, in all honesty, our lives have changed significantly, right? Where we value the relationships with the people that we have now, right? We value the time away from the workplace. And I don't know if 2 years ago, if I would have understood what that looked like.
Right. I'll tell you a secret. When I burned out in 2004, it was a miserable experience. But I know now, with many years that have gone on since then, where I refuse to work 16-hour days. I refuse to push myself beyond what I know that I'm physically capable of. And I refuse to take bad treatment from anybody. There is no money that's worth it. So, with all these boundaries and limitations, I can tell you for sure that the quality of my work has increased significantly. So, that idea that I had, and that I think you had, that this is what a committed, dedicated employee does, is false. There's all the evidence under the basic rest and activity cycle and the work of Tony Schwartz and the Energy Project, that our productivity, our creativity, our critical thinking, our quality of work all goes down after about less than 8 hours. We just can't focus. And so we can be busy and we can produce a lot, but then the time we take to fix it or correct it or explain it, or yeah. So again, for those who are listening who think, yes, I am ambitious and I am dedicated and I am going to climb that ladder, climbing it one rung at a time is going to be more productive. So today now, Angeline, where are you and what are you focused on? What are you looking at?
So what I do now is, so I consult while I work on my PhD. And so I deal mainly with safety systems, but because of the research that I've done, and I've worked with you on the standard as well for psychological health and safety, what I've started to identify is that there are significant gaps in the way that we currently silo what is considered safety in certain environments. And so it's quite interesting, because if we just go back to this idea of consistent steps to success, I think that through this journey of the last 2 years of working on the PhD, what it's taught me is I've produced greater insights and perhaps had a bigger impact on certain parts of the sector of aviation just by literally doing one thing at a time. And it's quite an interesting, I think, reflection when I think about it, because to tie into what you said, it was this idea of just constant go, 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 produce results. Let's just get it done. We have a deadline. And yeah, I've got a deadline for school. Of course I do. But we physically cannot learn that much, and the output can't be that much. And so what I've realized through this journey is that it's okay to slow it down, right? Because when you slow it down, the output is substantial, right? And I sleep at 9:30, right? I
Yeah.
sleep at 9:30, by 10 I'm out. But in that time, what I'm able to do is draw connections that I never had the time to connect because I was constantly exhausted thinking about what I had to do tomorrow. So with this, what I've been recently identifying is that currently the way that we structure what is considered reportable as far as safety in the workplace, it tends to work on definitions that are specific to operational safety. And specifically, I'll speak to the sector of aviation. Those regulations are governed by, Transport Canada. And then we have the regulations that fall under the Canada Labour Code that deal with violence in the workplace, where psychological health and safety starts to fit in. And what we start to see is those two don't talk to each other. And so we start to give a lot of importance to what's considered safe, like keeping our equipment safe, keeping our infrastructure safe, but we forget about our people. And so through the work that I'm doing, it started to open up doors to understand what's affecting people. And when we look at diverse labor markets, as we do in Canada, especially groups of people who are underrepresented, we start to see that they're affected by simple things like their identity, right? And they're targeted in the workplace through things such as normalized sexism, racism, xenophobia, and homophobia. But people don't tend to see it because they're so underrepresented, and they wouldn't dare speak up because what they could potentially lose, which is their job.
The statistics that we produced in a survey, we did a national survey on psych health and safety. And when you looked at it as a whole, it looked like people that were in equity deserving groups were doing just fine. But then when you pulled out the idea of belonging, the idea of discrimination, the idea of bullying from the sort of aggregate totals, it told a completely different picture. And that was fascinating to me that anybody who says, well, 95% of our employees feel we're inclusive. We only have 4% of people who are not, the mainstream white folks. So of course that's going to say
Right.
that. So yeah, somebody said to me years ago, fools figure and figures fool. And we really have to know how to read the statistics to understand them. But you mentioned something else that really hit me. You said that when you slowed down a bit, you were able to start to reflect and to think. And there's a term that we learned, which is praxis, which means that you do, but then you stop and you think about it, you critically analyze it, and then you adjust and you do again. But so many people are just doing every moment of every day that they never get to step back and think, is this even important? Is it effective? Is there a better way? And it is probably why, and you're just making me think this through, it's probably a big reason why the quality of my work is better now, because I can stop and think about it. Yeah.
Right.
So in terms of what you are doing with your PhD, can you sort of give us the Coles notes on
Sure.
what you've found and what you think you're going to find?
Absolutely. So the research is all done. It took a year. But what I've actually done is I've followed this approach of qualitative research where I've engaged in semi-structured interviews. So instead of looking at big numbers, I've looked at smaller segments of people and spent about an hour and a half up to 3 hours where people have shared parts of their life, approximately 60 people, well, 58 to be exact. And I looked at different types of occupations in the field of aviation. So looking at people that were high status, so pilots, and then I've looked at aircraft maintenance engineers who are equally as important in the role of aviation safety, but perceptually are seen as lower status workers, right? And then I've asked for observations from safety managers and people that are in the field of occupational health and safety to see what they observe, so I can triangulate the information. But what's emerged, and it's kind of sad, if I can be really honest, is that there is 20 years of history of research specifically that talks about the normalization of discrimination in the sector, right? And specifically sexism towards women, right? And the research just confirms that. But what it also confirms is the prevalence and the existence of bullying across the aircraft maintenance sector specifically. And so what we see is higher status jobs don't actually face bullying, right? So captains don't perceive that they've experienced bullying. Yet anybody who's lower off on, I would say, the hierarchy scale, especially people that are in roles of like an apprenticeship and learning how to do something, face a lot more bullying. And those are the people that are more vulnerable because they need to learn, right? And they require that mentorship and support. The other thing that I've done is we tend to have these single buckets. So we'll say, all women. So you and I, Mary Ann, we have the exact same experiences as everybody else, right? Like all the women in all of Canada, regardless of where you are, you have the exact same experiences. So what I've done is I've pulled out something called intercategorical data. And I've looked specifically at race, gender, occupation, occupational status, and whether or not you are an immigrant to Canada or, you know, you were born and raised here. And I've compared the different experiences of the different profiles of people in the study. It took a bit of time, so I can understand why people don't generally want to spend this much time doing that. But what really stood out is that people who are racialized and immigrants to Canada tend to face more compounded versions or forms of discrimination. So in addition to bullying, they may face sexism and racism. And so what we start to see is these tend to be invisible, right? And we also don't know how to have conversations with people often when they're facing all of these various forms of workplace discrimination that affect them.
Can you give very concrete examples
Yeah.
of the type of behavior that is experienced by this group that you're talking about, Angeline? Because sometimes people don't even understand the impact.
Oh, absolutely. And I think in all fairness, once I start talking about my research, I get all excited and everybody else is like, right? They glaze over because they're just like, oh God. So for example, I spoke to, I think 4 pilots that were women, right? And they were first officers and 1 captain. And they mentioned facing sexism 17 times, right? And their experiences were, you know, I was stuck on a pairing for 4 days with a captain who was yelling at me. And he was yelling at me, and I don't actually know what I did. And so I was asked, do you want to fly back? You know, are you safe enough to fly back? And the response was, I can be professional, right? And I'll come back to that statement in a second. So the female first officer said, you know what, I will do it. I will fly back. And during the entire flight back, their thought was, how can I get away from this person that I'm stuck in a cockpit with, right? Sure, I'm flying the aircraft, I'm doing everything I need to do, but my brain isn't there because I just want to be as far out of this plane as I possibly can be, right? Which raises the concern of, when did we start thinking that being professional is also safe? right? That I find very concerning. And a lot of people in the study said, because I'm professional, it's okay. But now we start to see, for example, we had a woman who had come to Canada, had been in the sector for about 20 years. And she was taking the TTC, right, public transit, to go to work by the airport, which was quite a distance because she didn't have any other way to get there as she was starting her life in Canada. And she was on the bus and had taken her coat off, had taken off her wedding ring, put it in the pocket and forgot it. And so when she came to work the very first day, the very first thing that happened was people didn't see her because she wasn't seen as the type of person who would be an aircraft maintenance engineer. So they said, "When's the new girl coming?" And she was sitting there and she was like, "I am the new girl," right? So then this incident happens where she misplaces her ring and she comes to work and she just needs somebody to care. And it sounds so simple, but nobody cared, right? And she also had the key for her lockbox for her tools, right? So she was like, "Can anybody help me?" And so people tried at first and they said, "We have to focus on our jobs." And she told me, she goes, eventually somebody walked up and said, "I can help you, but I need to help you when nobody's looking because, they're going to make comments about me helping you." And so eventually somebody helped her, but it was when nobody else was there. So to feel that level of exclusion from a group of people, right? Does it have the same perhaps workplace safety implications? Not necessarily. It's like a first officer situation and we've got a person who's locked out from their toolbox. But the feeling of not being accepted and knowing that they're different and having everybody else tell them who they are the types of things that are very difficult to consider tangible. Like, sorry, let me rephrase that. It's very difficult to frame as something tangible because a lot of the time when somebody is experiencing something based on their identity, or we'll call them a social inequity, it's very hard for somebody else to understand if they've never felt it.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because I'm thinking about men that have explained to me why they're stressed out at work. And it includes being ridiculed, being ignored, feeling that they're being judged, people teasing them about messing up or calling them names. And I think the difference might be that they would only tell me, they wouldn't speak up either. They just had to have that rough exterior. And so on the one hand, I think that women in the workplace are verbalizing it, but I don't think it's exclusively a female experience.
Oh, not at all. So it's quite interesting you raise that point. So I had, I was so lucky to have the participants in my study. Absolutely fortunate. And I had a lot of aircraft maintenance engineers, and they were thrilled to be able to speak about their experiences. But it was if they didn't fit this macho profile,
Mhm.
right? If somebody was too happy, right? It was a personality trait and they like to make jokes, it was a problem. And you can see through the course of our interviews, what you could see is how it was impacting people, right?
Mhm.
One person said, I used to make jokes and he was snapped at because of the fact that his colleague couldn't deal with that. Another person was constantly bullied for the fact that he was non-confrontational, just a personality type. He didn't like confrontation. And so he would sit there and he was constantly berated by his boss, right? And it got to the point where finally he had to go through this. He was going through depression. Finally, just one day he walked in and he quit,
Mm.
right?
Good
Um,
for him.
yeah, but it took 10 years,
Mhm.
right? And we also see that a lot of men have that sense of, just like I would say all workers, that sense of responsibility where, this is what you've trained for. This is what you know. And part of this survival is considered a rite of passage. So eventually, as you endure and you tolerate and you essentially become a broken person, eventually you're considered okay because you've served your dues. And that sort of a culture is fairly toxic, but
Mhm.
extremely damaging to a lot of these people. Where I remember another one of my research participants said, "Do you know what?" He goes, delicate." He goes, "I have a delicate frame." Right? He didn't use the word delicate, but he was quite petite, and a lot of the other men were bigger. And he said, "You know what? People used to make fun of the fact that I don't have the strength." Right? He goes, "I could fit into crevices and corners and, do everything that needed to be done." He goes, "But I simply was getting bullied because I wasn't big and brawny." Right? So we see this a lot, and it's part of that idea of banter or it's okay.
Yeah, that we're just having fun.
Yeah.
But there's having fun, and then there's having fun at someone else's expense. And I feel very strongly that we need to enjoy work, that we need to have a sense of humor, we need to have some fun. But we can do that without it being by ridiculing or humiliating someone else. And um, I've worked in all male um, teams where this toxicity had reached crisis.
Sure.
And in each of the teams, when they had to stop the teasing and humiliation with a lot of resistance, right? That's just the way we are. We're just, in several cases, people came back to me, and the people that resisted and said, I enjoy work more now. And that's the thing, right? Just because this is the way we've always done it doesn't mean it's better. I want to bring you back to something else that you said, which is that the safety people are focused on physical safety.
Mhm.
And I think that even those of us that were part of the standard to begin with thought psychological health and safety was separate from physical safety or, tactical safety. And it was Andrew Harkness, who was with the Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. He said, people being afraid
Yes.
for their safety is a psychological risk.
Yeah.
And he brought it forward to all of us to understand that if I don't have the right focus and the right energy at work, that not only is that detrimental to my well-being, but it's detrimental to my safety, to the safety of the people around me, and to my productivity. And
Mhm.
so I think there's steps being taken to say safety is all of that. But what do you think it's going to take for us
So,
to get there?
well, I want to share a quick story with you, and then one of the research participants, was telling me a little bit of a story about he works again as an aircraft maintenance engineer, quite macho. Um, and it's the man's environment where there's a bit of homophobia that's quite common and underpins a lot of how people interact with one another. And so it became his norm that as an openly gay man, he was facing, these comments. And he was working on an aircraft and he was wiring certain things. And he could hear this conversation about him in the background. And he's working on something that requires an aircraft to be safe. And so he got frustrated. He got up and he walked around, cleared his head, had a drink of water, came back and was like, okay. But he checked and he realized that he wired a few things incorrectly.
Mm.
And then he rewired it and closed everything up and went as far as to rearrange his schedule so he didn't have to work on the very day that his manager was working. Right. And so my research shows that actually for the participants that we had from the maintenance group, they have most of these negative interactions and these comments that affect them from managers.
Mhm.
Right. And so what we start to see is this link between the fact that our social interactions, our psychosocial factors, right, that actually degrade your well-being as well as your psychological health and safety, but they also degrade the performance of your duties in the workplace, right, as shown through this example. Ooh, excuse me, as shown through this example of the aircraft maintenance engineer, right? Um, but he wouldn't dare speak up about this specifically because what's the point? It's the manager,
Yeah. And
right?
it's not going to bode well for your career
Not at all.
to do that. This is really something we've been talking about a lot lately, Angeline, and it is the idea that yes, you've got great workshops and you've got good tools and resources and you've got the great posters on the wall and you tell your leaders they need to be psychologically safe, but do you ever measure? Do you ever hold them accountable?
Mhm.
And that has to be by being clear about what the behaviors are that support psychological health and safety, and then asking the employees to rate them on those things rather than simply saying, we care, we feel that psychological health and safety matters. And look at all the programs we've implemented.
Right.
Can you speak a bit on how, if you had the ability to make change, how would you do it?
I think so the simple thing is this idea of what safety culture is, right? I think it comes down to safety culture is no longer just this idea of things that we put in the actual physical building. Safety culture is the way we engage with one another. It's how we treat one another. It's the most basic things of respect in the workplace to get the job done, to perform, to be productive. And I believe it really does start with this worker-centric approach. So yes, we need to have the policies that say, we're going to have, I do believe there needs to be a zero tolerance for certain types of behaviors. And if it's against the law under the Canada Labor Code, perhaps it should be against the law in the workplace, right? So if we're not going to tolerate like certain types of behaviors, why is it okay when it happens occupationally, right? So I think it's about holding people accountable, but it's also creating a general idea of these types of behaviors, as you said, are completely unacceptable. And if you're going to be in a role of oversight, in a role of management, these are the types of behaviors you need to work against to support this holistic idea of safety, perhaps bring well-being into it. But then most importantly, we need that feedback loop, right? Because a lot of the time, people that are situated in places where they're creating the policies and whatever they believe drives change may be so disconnected from the actual frontline staff.
Well, and I've seen cases where the leader themselves is inclusive, supportive. They are just really emotionally intelligent. They're great people, but they never changed the way the employees treated each other. And
Mhm.
so there's more to it than, are you a good leader or are you not a good leader? It's, do you um, provide a psychologically safe environment and do you reinforce it? And that's been a really interesting thing, is it's not the good versus the bad, but
Mhm.
it's, do you even understand all the ways in which this can happen?
And I think we tend to forget we tend to forget that we have these overarching policies, which we need to have because it's what an organization is going to do and what they say they're going to do. But we tend to forget about that occupational level and what people do in the workplace to survive, right? And it could be building alliances with certain social groups. It could be, ducking under it and, trying to fly below the radar so they can stay employed until probation is over, right?
Yeah.
It's about all of these different sorts of techniques or coping mechanisms that people engage in. And because individuals aren't speaking up a lot of the time, right? It
Mhm.
makes it very, very difficult for people who are developing the policies to actually understand. And so that's why it's also really important to start asking different questions, right? And I believe it's about normalizing that conversation about bullying and discrimination in the workplace, right? Using the words like you would safety. Because a lot of the time there's stigmas associated with, saying I faced some form of, like, if I say, oh, I faced, bullying in the workplace. Oh, you're pulling out that card again, Angeline, right? And I'm like, what card? I was bullied by somebody in senior management. So,
Well, here's what I found with bullying is that most of the time, the bully would deny that that was their intention. They would say, no, I was just frustrated. I was trying to tell them how they needed to do their job. I was trying to clarify it's not my fault that they're hypersensitive. And this damage that these people were doing, whether it was intentional or unintentional, still happened. And so we actually shifted from talking about bullying to talking about psychologically safe interactions, and that it is not about your intention, it's about your impact. And taking away that defensiveness, just in the same way, I'm sure you've heard of white fragility, and that idea that if you accuse me of racism, I'm going to defend myself and say, no, I'm a good person. I would never do that. But in so doing, I refuse to listen to what I could do differently because I'm so busy defending that I don't mean harm. So in this setting, how do we get to these people in power who are having a negative impact and would deny that they're bullying?
mhm. That's a tough question, right? And I think that a lot of it has to do, and this is going to sound maybe out there pie in the sky, but I really believe that organizations have a responsibility, or even sectors for that reason, to look back at the way they've always done things, right? Reflect on the structures, right? And I know I've used the word reflect a lot, but it's because I've done that for the last 2 years, right? But reflect on the very structures, the way that we do things, right? And ask ourselves, is that continuing to impact people, and which people? Because oftentimes the people that are impacted are going to be the ones that never speak up. They're going to be underrepresented in the workplace, or they may be the most senior people that have been there and that'll speak up right before they have to retire, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
so true.
and when I speak about structures, like, I'll use the case study of aviation again because that's the one that I'm well versed in. But if we look back at the way the sector was developed, it was developed in 1917 following the first, or during the First World War. So it's only normal that we have those influences of hierarchy and structure and status and class. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just the way it was. But those have continued, right? And those have continued to the point where we have ignored, certain things, such as perhaps the way women were treated, right? We just kind of went, okay, that's not as relevant as, making sure that we don't crash aircraft, right? And so, but we've gotten to a point now where we're having these conversations about diverse labor markets. We're trying to rebalance just the workplace and create environments where people want to come in and stay there, and we have employment retention, right? We don't want to see skilled workforce leaving and taking up different occupations. And so all of these things that we once thought were good to do are in fact what you need to do for business, right? And so it becomes a bigger sort of, I would say, a complex issue where we need to sit down and ask ourselves, is it working? Has it worked? Who's it not working for? And what are we going to do to keep these people?
Yeah, these are all great questions, and I love a good question, Angeline, because I think I was just talking to Sonia Funk, and she was saying, if you're frustrated with something, ask a different question. And not the one that you keep asking. Why this? Why me? How is, this isn't, why are these employees doing this? But start to change it like you're saying, who does this serve and who does it not serve is a great way for people to rethink what they've always done.
Right. And with those questions, it's, I'm not sitting there going, here is your solution, ask a question. But by asking those questions, you start to say, hey, hang on a second. Perhaps we've not considered in the sector of aviation that aircraft require more aircraft maintenance engineers, right?
Mhm.
An aircraft can't fly without them. So why are we focusing on certain things like hierarchy and perhaps not training them on the importance of using soft skills to perform their technical skills, right? And so we start to see that the answers emerge just by asking these questions about what do we need to do to support the workforce?
Your statement is a great one, which is, how do we need soft skills? Why do we need soft skills to do technical work? And can you respond to that from your perspective?
Absolutely. When you're working in a team environment, and when I say a team environment, it could be remote, right? It could be where you have to call somebody up and communicate information, even written information that somebody else is going to read, right? So a team environment, anything more than one, right? There's always going to be that communication process. And how we communicate and get information across really does affect how people accept it, process it, and then create an output. And so when we're dealing with the importance of soft skills or non-technical skills, right? It has everything to do with how we actually communicate. And so if I'm speaking to you and I say, Mary Ann, blah, 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 and I'm screaming, and I'm yelling, and I'm like, oh, by the way, this wasn't working, right? Chances are you're not going to be focused on the fact that something's not working. You're going to be like, holy smokes, what just happened? What did I just do? Right? And we've seen that specifically with some of the apprentices or unlicensed aircraft maintenance engineers that were learning. And they were learning how to wire an aircraft or, turn wrenches, things that they needed to apply. And this one young man told me that he was getting yelled at. He thought he did the best job ever. And somebody came in and said, who did this? This is a piece of crap. It's absolute garbage. Right? And all of a sudden, he was like, I was so proud of myself. He goes, I thought I did such a good job. And he goes, and in that instant, he goes, I was put on the duty of cleaning oil buckets. And I had to ask the question. I said, I'm sorry, what? So he was penalized for what he was doing, right?
As an apprentice trying to learn.
Right. And he
Mhm.
was then, but this is the irony of it. He was asked to clean oil buckets, which are used to collect oil. So he had to clean them really well to then go and collect oil again.
Mhm.
As it's just some form of punitive action of you didn't do the job well. But had that communication been different and somebody said, hey, buddy, come over here. I know you were trying to do this, but this is how you do something differently. Let me show you, right?
Mhm.
Chances are, first of all, he would have learned how to do it properly and not felt like he did something wrong. Because every time now he works on something, in the back of his head, he's like, am I going to get yelled at?
Yeah.
Right?
Instead of, I'm going to focus on doing it right.
Right. The
Yeah.
second thing is to a certain degree, that treatment teaches him how to treat other people.
Mhm.
Right. And so we start to see this replication of a culture. And the third thing is that self-doubt that is now embedded and underpins everything that he's doing. It's going to take a very long time for that to go away. So he's more focused on how do I not clean an oil container, right? Versus how do I do my job properly to support the organization. And so when it comes to these non-technical skills, I'm a big advocate that they can be trained in when we start teaching people how to do things. And so if we say, right, before you start your day, we brief, we make sure everybody understands. And if you notice something, go up to them and raise an awareness and do something together or talk about it and debrief at the end of the day. It really does support organizational success. And we don't have people thinking, oh my God, I've done something so horrible, it's the end of the world.
Yeah. I know one industrial organization, and they have what we would call a huddle. And what they ask each person, because it's a safety sensitive place, is what's on your mind today? And it's a chance for someone to say, I had a fight just before I left the house, or, my arthritis is kicking up, or my child's in the hospital, or whatever it is, and allows leaders to ask the question, what can I do to support you to focus today?
Right.
And it really changes so that everybody becomes aware that everybody else is going through things. And of course, they only share what they want to share, but it just changes the tone from, okay, here's your marching orders, to I see you, I hear you. Yeah.
And Marian, it's such an important thing where you said, I see you and I hear you. Traditional approach to the workforce is you're here, you get the work done, that's it, right? And as we start to see this change in how we understand how valuable people are, right? We start to understand that what's affecting them is going to affect everything that we do, but also the way we allow things to happen in the workplace, more than anything, it's going to affect them.
I think an important piece, and I say this for all the people who have ever been leaders or business owners, is that if this psychologically safe approach also reduced productivity or quality of work or performance, I could see why we might say, look, we're not daycare, we're not family. You're here to do a job, we pay you to do the job. But all of the research that we've seen is the opposite, that if you want people to be committed, to be loyal, to be focused, this is the way to do it. It's not about being nice. It's a good business decision.
And that's the thing that blows my mind more than anything is we are seeing, like, we're living through this, I believe it's called the Great Resignation, right? We're seeing this happen and people are leaving because they're faced with a choice between themselves to a certain degree and what an employer wants. And it's beyond me how we can't just shorten that gap a little bit to say, why can't we adapt business processes, because so many different sectors have, right, to support people, right, so that they can have that work-life balance, but when they come back to work, they're refreshed and they're actually wanting to contribute to a better place, as opposed to, let me just spend my time here today and then, clock out.
Yeah.
And I find it a little bit shocking because I think one of the interesting things that came out through some of my research is that there's different ways that well-being is degraded, right? We've got the words that people can say, stress and anxiety. We know that people start to feel frustrated and powerless. We also know that there's that self-doubt. But the one interesting thing that people tend to overlook is how we take what happens in the workplace and we mobilize it, we embody it, and we take it home with us.
Mhm.
And then it affects our personal lives. But then it becomes cyclical, right? And so in your work, I was going to say, what have you seen as far as that element where things become cyclical, where work life is now affecting home life? And
We read research, and Angeline, this had to be like 20 years ago. And it first of all said that stress at work is, I think they use the term more permeable. Stress at work is more likely to impact the family than family stress is likely to impact work. But they also talked about, somebody saying, well, they were stressed out because they were going through a divorce, but they're going through a divorce because they were always at work and it broke down the relationship. And so, in places where they say, well, that's because they have mental health issues, but they don't want to recognize the impact that stress at work had on the ability to cope. Many people live with mental health issues, but if you're in a toxic work environment, it becomes worse. If you're in a supportive work environment, it's actually protective for mental health issues. So yeah, there's lots, right? That we can say, these people who say, just leave your personal issues at the door, don't understand the human mind at all. When we say bring our whole selves to work, I think what people worry about is that means, okay, so you can bring your grumpy self, you can bring your lazy self, you can bring, your whole self, but that's not what it means. It means that we see the whole person and support them to do their job in the state they're in that day.
And I think that's where that shift of I would say that shift of understanding the worker comes in, right? And for so long, that narrative of leave yourself at the door, right? When you come to work, you're just here to work. I've heard that for so many years. Like, when you report safety issues, only report the facts, right? Don't report your feelings. And up until recently, I never questioned it because it's just the way you've always done things. And I had to ask myself, but isn't it in the feelings that tell us what they're actually going through?
What the impact
right?
of the safety violation is.
Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
that's the one thing that we tend to do, especially in like safety specific structures or sectors that have these clear definitions of what's safety reportable. We tend to only look for things that are within the purview of our metrics that we can measure. And anything that's not in it, rather than communicating it to occupational health and safety or to HR, we tend to just forget about it. And so there's all of this rich information that comes into systems already. If we actually took the time to look at it and say, we're going to give it equal value, right? That we could actually start to understand what's happening to the actual workforce itself, as opposed to how can we support safety mitigation and forget that we need to remember how we're going to protect the worker in their entirety as well.
Believe it or not, we are running out of time. I have another question for you, and that is, if you were talking to someone who isn't in your field, doesn't have any idea what you're talking about, how would you describe what it feels like to be in a psychologically healthy and safe workplace?
I would say the feeling of a psychologically safe environment for me would be a place where I walk in, I feel included, I feel valued, I feel respected, not from just the person beside me, but from everybody within the organization. I know that if I have a concern, that I could walk into an office and express it and not be afraid of how people are going to perceive me, that I won't be gossiped about, right? And that I'll be heard. And that perhaps, maybe, if possible, something will be done about my concern. And I think that for me would be a place where I just feel valued and just seen.
Very good. Thank you for that. Now, Angeline, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you about your consulting services, how would they do that?
So I've got my email, which is Mary Ann.
Are you looking it up?
I think I'm gonna have to.
Oh no. Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's because I want to give you the most correct one, and I'm sorry about this. Is very embarrassing. But I believe it's info at angelineram.ca. So it's ANGELINERAM.ca. I'm so embarrassed.
Not at all. I know you're finishing up your PhD and starting your consulting business, and you probably have had a half a dozen other emails in your life like the rest of us. So no problem at all. So Angeline, thank you so much for being my guest today and for sharing, some very practical strategies and information that people can use to advocate for psychological health and safety in their workplace.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mary Ann.
Yeah. And for the listeners, subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and you get to listen to more amazing people like Angeline on the Psych Health and Safety podcast. Thanks very much. Have a great day.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.